It's Thursday, June 5th, 2025, and you are listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the free world. I am Jonathan Mervertis of the Hoover Institution, and I'm sitting in the chair of Bill Whalen, the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism, so that he can answer questions and provide commentary about California policy and politics, in which he is well versed. Bill Whalen, in addition to being a Washington Post columnist, writes weekly for Hoover's California on Your Mind web channel. Whalen is joined today by Lee Ohanian, Hoover Institution Senior Fellow and Professor of Economics and Director of the Ettinger Family Program in Macroeconomic Research at the University of California, Los Angeles. Ohanian also writes weekly about the policy environment of the Golden State for California on Your Mind. Gentlemen, how are you doing today?
Good, good.
How you fellas doing?
Very good.
It's early June in Northern California. Life is good. It's about 72 degrees here, Lee. It's Santa Barbara weather.
Yeah, we're having Bay Area weather. We were overcast, like 65 degrees, but I'm not complaining.
We're having Arizona weather here, and it's close to 100 degrees, so I envy.
Well, shall we do sports next or get on with the news?
Yeah, so let's talk about the latest developments in policy and politics in the Golden State. Lee, let's start off with your recent column in California on Your Mind, which discusses the U.S. Senate vote to block Governor Newsom's executive order requiring all new vehicles sold in California by 2035 to be zero-emission vehicles. You explain why the legislation is misguided in the first place. Quote, the key issue with California's aggressive fight against climate change, including the 2035 ZEV mandate, is that it hasn't adequately recognized the trade-offs involved with its policy choices. Specifically, any policy choice involves potential costs as well as potential benefits, and we obviously need to prioritize those policies for which the expected benefits far outweigh expected costs. But that hasn't always happened with California's climate policies. Lee, what are the expected costs? And second, with California EV sales plateauing, could the state even have met this mandate?
Well, Jonathan, this is probably going to be a blessing in disguise for California drivers because, demand for EVs may be close to being saturated at this point. Most purchasers of EVs up to this point have been relatively wealthy households. There are households with multiple vehicles. About 90% of those households have a gasoline-powered car. And it's interesting, in California, the average number of miles driven by an EV is only about 28 miles per day. So these are vehicles that are bought with substantial tax incentives and tax credits, and they're very much a second car. They're not really a good choice at this point for families that will have one vehicle or who will be using that electric vehicle as a primary car with very long distance driving. So Jonathan, it really boils down to the issue that there's not just an awful lot of demand out there beyond what's already been purchased. And you see this being discussed by a number of automakers, other experts in the auto industry. And EVs have become very expensive for California because what we do is we require a certain number of vehicles to be sold in California as EVs. Otherwise, we penalize automakers at about $20,000 per vehicle if they don't deliver enough EVs relative to gasoline-powered cars, or they have to buy credits from an EV company such as Tesla. But given all this, Jonathan, California has jumped into renewables and reducing carbon emissions, much more so than most other states, and it's very, very expensive. Over 600,000 workers in California are in the clean energy industry. That compares with only about 50,000 workers, so about 1/12 or 1/13 of the number of workers in the oil and gas industry. And despite that lopsided number of workers, only about 28% of California's electricity came from solar and wind power. So you look at that, and it's not a sense of markets being used effectively. Renewables have become very, very expensive. The policies that California have implemented are very, very expensive. We have I believe the highest gasoline prices in the country at over $5 a gallon. It's 50% more than the U.S. average. We have the fifth highest natural gas prices. We have the fourth highest electricity prices. And when you think about that, those are very burdensome on middle income and low income households. So there's just a lot that we're doing that's not really paying off very much, but that is costing Californians an awful lot.
So, Lee, I have two questions for you. First, when the Senate did its vote, Governor Newsom came out very strong against it and said basically they want to turn the clock back on California back to the 50s, 60s, 70s and the bad old days of bad air in Los Angeles. Interesting message because a lot of Californians don't remember those days. We're talking 50, 60 years ago. So one question, Lee, is really how critical is this to air quality in California? But the second is that Newsom at all times equates this mandate to innovation. It's a word he chooses deliberately. Why do you think he is using the word innovation?
Well, Bill, he compared it, I believe, to the iPhone, Apple's iPhone, just just a few miles down the road from where you are. So I think that frames it, very attractively from his purpose to say, well, we're doing the Lord's work here. We're innovating. The obvious difference is that the iPhone was developed within the context of for-profit markets by a manufacturer who had to figure out what's the demand for the product, what are people willing to pay, how much will it cost them to produce, how much will it cost them to make it better in the future. If you applied the same standards to EVs, we would hardly have any EVs. They're very expensive. They're expensive to repair. They depreciate very, very quickly. There's some EVs that lose half of their value in the first year. On average, they lose half of their value within the first 3 years. And a big issue with them is that the battery replacements can be very, very expensive. People just don't want them. Even the profit margins, so we're forcing auto producers to create a certain number of EVs for California, and they're not profitable. To put this in context, the average gross profit margin in U.S. industries is about 34%. The most profitable EV production in the United States is by Tesla at about 7%. So about 1/5 the profit margin. So there's just nothing from the standpoint of markets that says this is a good thing to be doing. And Bill, it's interesting what, relative to your question about clean air. So back in the 60s and 70s, California just had a horrible smog problem. I remember as a little kid and growing up in LA in the late 60s and early 70s, oftentimes we had to go inside and stay there until the stage 3 smog alert was downgraded to a stage 1 smog alert. And when you drove across the 405 from Los Angeles over into the San Fernando Valley, you couldn't see very far beyond your windshield. And now when I do that driving from UCLA, you see the beautiful San Fernando Valley. We've made enormous progress on smog, but reducing carbon emissions doesn't have any direct benefits for Californians because these are greenhouse gas emissions. It's CO2, and that's a global phenomenon. California is responsible for less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So even if we had a magic wand and we could reduce carbon emissions by 50%, it wouldn't even really move the needle. So the governor's analogy with the iPhone really is in my opinion misplaced, and this kind of goes back to a longstanding criticism of governments picking industrial winners. We're just not very good at it. Japan failed at that in the 70s and 80s. We're going to be closing down a $2+ billion power plant in the Mojave Desert that's only been operating for 11 years. And I think the first 3 or 4 of those weren't very effective. That power plant it was an enormous solar power plant that was supposed to have potentially a 45-year lifespan. It's going to effectively being shut down after 11 years, maybe 7 good years, because better technologies have emerged. And this is what happens when we allow governments to try to pick industrial winners or losers. There's no reason to believe they're going to be better than the marketplace. And the historical record is that they've been worse than that.
So you're telling me that the governor is saying, in essence, I've seen the future and the future is electric vehicles. My question, Lee, is this. There is a country on the other side of the Pacific Rim that is just producing tons and tons of cheap electric vehicles, China. So why isn't Governor Newsom reaching out to China and trying to flood the California market with cheap Chinese cars?
Oh my goodness, yeah, I think wouldn't that be that would be an interesting political situation for him, wouldn't it? Particularly after his visit to China, what was that, Bill, a year or two ago when he claimed that he had these really difficult conversations with Xi and that they were going to be cooperating on carbon emissions and global warming and of course, the Chinese record of that was nothing at all, nothing at all like that. And speaking of China, over 50% of the electricity is created by burning coal, which is one of the most polluting fossil fuels. So I don't think the governor really has much to stand on here. I mean, we'll see what happens in the courts, but we're nowhere close to being able to get to that 100% ZEV sales target in 10 years. And I mean, personally, I don't think we'll get anywhere close to that, even if the mandate was restored.
So Arnold Schwarzenegger had a phrase when he was governor. He'd always talk about talk about the can getting kicked down the road. That was his catch-all phrase anytime the legislature would just take a pass or delay the inevitable. So do you think they're going to kick the can down the road here, Lee, and maybe push the mandate back to 2040 or 2045? Because it sure sounds like come 2033 or 2034, the state's not going to be in any position to put this into play in 2035.
No. I mean, we would need just to meet the target, I believe, for next year, we would need to have about 1/3 growth in sales. And I think last year we just had 1% growth. So we're not going to get anywhere close to that. And the governor, the governor, in Arnold's words, kicked the can down the road with his housing goals. When he ran for governor back in 2018, he made a promise of developing a Marshall Plan for housing and just an enormous goal of building, I believe, about 500,000 houses per year between 2018 and 2025. And so he pushed the target date back, I think, to 2030, and he reduced the number of homes to be built. So he's moving the goalposts as well as kicking the can down the road. So if he does that, and I suspect he will, it won't be anything that he hasn't done before.
Now, while we're on the topic of cars and energy, I was just in South Carolina recently where the locals are up in arms, Lee, because the price of gasoline is approaching $3 a gallon. Meanwhile, in California, there's a report out that says the price of gasoline could be $8.50 come next year. So what are we doing here, Lee?
Bill, I think you should have them start paying for your ticket, because if they came out to visit you in California, I mean, what would they be saying when they saw these prices here? Yeah, Bill, there are plans to shut down two refineries. One is by Valerio, and I think the other one is maybe an old Phillips 66 refinery. Right. That could reduce refinery capacity by 20%. California is in a unique position. It's not a particularly good unique position that our fuel blend is different than the rest of the country's. And it's either produced here, and if it's not produced here, it comes from either South Korea or New Brunswick, Canada, places that aren't so close. It's expensive to bring that fuel here. So if we lost 20% of our refinery capacity, supply would fall substantially, potentially. And gasoline is a commodity that consumers aren't very price sensitive to that. So what I mean is that it's not as if they cut their consumption substantially in response to a small increase in the price. Instead, it takes a really big increase in the price to get them to cut their
Right, but it has an ancillary effect in that that's more money out of your pocket, so that's less money you can spend elsewhere in the economy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, I mean, I suspect it'll easily go over $7 a gallon if we do lose 20% of capacity, because it takes for every 1% increase in the price of gasoline, consumers drop their demand by about 1/3 of 1%. So if you do the math, $7 a gallon gas is really pretty easy to see.
Well, I think lawmakers need to be on notice here. Gray Davis got kicked out of office in 2003. Why? Energy crisis in California, rolling blackouts. A state senator was recalled more recently. Why? Because the legislature approved a tax increase in gasoline. People pay attention where their precious commodity of gasoline and energy are being messed with.
Oh my goodness, yes, yeah, yeah. And Bill, it's interesting. We had not only the US, but the world had an energy crisis back before 1900. In major cities, the horse-drawn carriage was the primary mode of transportation. Excuse me. Cities like New York and London were literally being suffocated by horse droppings. Thousands of people were dying every year from manure-borne bacteria. And in just about a 25-year period, horses were completely replaced. We no longer had the problem of horse manure because the nascent internal combustion engine had just come online, and technological innovations made it very easy to put into a car. And what needs to be acknowledged here, I think, by policymakers is that there are trade-offs. It's not as if there's a free lunch out there to say, well, we've got this problem with carbon emissions and we're going to do whatever it takes to get rid of those. No, you got to look at the costs and the benefits. And, we've been subsidizing solar and wind now for the better part of 50 years, going back to the energy crises of the early and late 1970s. The advertising campaign was always, gosh, you know what? In another 10 years, solar will be there and we'll be getting so much of our electricity from solar. And that was repeated every decade after decade after decade. And I think this is another case where governments may have just by putting all of our subsidy eggs into the baskets of solar and wind. I think that was probably a mistake. We might be a lot further ahead with renewables if we'd had more of a level playing field and pursued some different alternative energy sources.
So the good news for the governor, if you can call it that, is to the extent that he's hounded by very bad visuals of California right now, I think we'd agree, Lee, the visual that haunts him is what? Homeless encampments. We're going to get to homelessness in a couple minutes here on this podcast. I would argue that if gasoline goes over $7, Lee, you're going to see a return to that gas station in Menlo Park that a few years ago took down the numerical prices and put up instead arm and a leg. And that's going to be your new California meme.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I pity. You remember you remember the old show, the A-Team, and Mr. T would say, I pity the fool. We're going to talk about gubernatorial issues later, but I pity the governor that's going to have to come in and deal with that.
Yes.
Gentlemen, let's talk about the 2026 election politics. This coming January marks the 60th anniversary of the beginning of Ronald Reagan's successful 1966 gubernatorial run. In your column, Bill, for California in Your Mind this week, you described the lack of Hollywood stars in California politics. Within the last century, Reagan was part of a long list of celebrities who caught fame in California, in California politics. There's the actress turned Congresswoman Helen Hagan Douglas, who ran unsuccessfully against Richard Nixon for a U.S. Senate seat in 1952. There was the song and dance man, George Murphy, who was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1964, serving one term. Don't forget Clint Eastwood, who we're going to talk about later, who served as mayor of Carmel in the 1980s. And then, of course, the governor, action hero Arnold Schwarzenegger, who served 2 terms as governor between 2003 and 2010. Yesterday, there was a bipartisan gathering of would-be gubernatorial candidates that took place in Sacramento. At this forum were former Representative Katie Porter of the Irvine area, Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco, former legislative leader Tony Atkins, and former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, and current Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis. Of those two, Bianco and Hilton, conservative commentator Steve Hilton, were the only Republicans there. Why the dearth of A-listers, Bill? Even for the most liberal celebrities, has California become that unglamorous?
Well, that's a good question, Jonathan. So keep in mind the primary in California is still 2 days shy of a year from now. It's first Tuesday in June of 2026. So maybe an A-lister jumps in. But I wanted to point out that if you look at Reagan's run and also Schwarzenegger's run for governor, the timing worked out very well for both. Ronald Reagan was past his peak of acting by then. He was doing GE theater and Death Valley Days and so forth. He was on the downside slope. Arnold by 2003 was getting long in the tooth for an action hero. His big hits were back in the 90s, but still high name recognition. So you have to find somebody who I think Jonathan Lee is not necessarily at the peak of their powers and is willing to kind of walk away. Not too many of those. It might also be a reflection just that politics is ugly and bruising right now. And then if you jump in, you're going to get attacked thanks to social media. So maybe that kind of explains it as well. Now, there is a celebrity who could run for governor. Kamala Harris is at least a political celebrity, if not a Hollywood celebrity, but at least a political one. But you notice, Lee and Jonathan, that she is not taking part in these candidates' forums. There was, previous to this event you mentioned in Sacramento, which was run by the California Chamber of Commerce, there's a Democratic Party gathering in Los Angeles previous weekend. She did not go in person. She sent in what by the crowd's estimates was a pretty underwhelming video, just kind of a paint by numbers video, not very passionate, not very exciting, certainly no policy ideas. And so this race is kind of waiting for Godot in that regard. It's getting back to Richard Nixon. All roads lead to Nixon on this podcast. 1962, he runs. She would be the new Nixon in that regard, a former vice president who had lost the previous presidential election having a go at it. But I just, you look at celebrities right now, and there are just no A-listers out there right now, no perfect fits. The closest thing we have to an A-lister who is politically hungry, it would seem, is Matthew McConaughey. All right. But Matthew McConaughey wants to run in Texas, not California. And Lee, this gets back to, your comment about Mr. T and Pity the Fool. That person's going to come into office in 2027. They're going to have to deal with this mandate we've been talking about. They're going to have to deal with a messy, messy budget, which we will get to, I think, in our July podcast. But that is now being talked about as what is called a structural deficit, meaning that the lawmakers have baked in so much money into the the budget that essentially you're looking at raising taxes or borrowing a ton of money to paper it over each year. Add that to the assortment of the California headaches, it's not going to be a very fun ride, if you will. So I think for most politicians these days, it's just easier to stay on the sidelines, tweet, if you will, bash Donald Trump, if you will, but yet another thing to actually want to go to Sacramento and change things.
Oh my goodness, this what a thankless job this has become, particularly, Bill, with the budget. And as you noted, we have structural deficits now, meaning that you look out 1, 2, 3 years, it still looks like a budget deficit. And what happened a couple of years ago is that the governor's office projected revenues that were far too high. I think by about somewhere between 160 to 180 billion dollars in revenue over about a 4-year period. And they, in my opinion, they made a mistake by just simply projecting out from very high capital gains revenues realizations that came in around that time. And as we know, when you have high capital gains realizations one year, you tend not to have such high capital realizations the following years. But they projected not only high continuation of high capital gains realizations, but increasing capital gains realization. So I don't think there's really any, empirical basis for that, but that's the mess we find ourselves in. And we're going to have a mess with energy. We're going to have a continued mess with housing affordability and with homelessness. Bill, it's hard for me to look at that job and say, what person in their right mind would really want to be trying to do that now. It's interesting. I guess, Bill, the 6 who appeared on the stage, were those the 6 that are polling the highest right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And it's interesting, you said there's no A-listers. Katie Porter finished She finished 3rd in the Senate race behind Adam Schiff and Steve Garvey. That doesn't sound very good. You have Tony Atkins, who I think has probably almost no name recognition outside of San Diego. There's Villaraigosa, although he hasn't been on the political stage for a long time, and he ran against Newsom in 22 and really didn't get much traction.
You're talking Antonio Villaraigosa, Lee. You're talking about somebody who at the 2012 convention was desperately trying to angle his way into a transportation secretary job in the Obama administration. That's 13 years ago. So So I have a theory that politicians, candidates are very much like dairy products. There's a certain expiration date. I don't know if that applies to Antonio or not, but he was a big deal thing. One other thing to point out, by the way, about celebrities running, there's a wonderful book written about Reagan's run for governor. It's called The Right Moment. It's written by Matthew Dallek, who is the son of the Robert Dallek, the presidential historian. And it's really a terrific book if you listeners and are interested in California politics in this regard. It chronicles how Reagan came into the race, how the state party did not cotton to Reagan at all. They thought that he was an extremist. They was just represented the John Birch wing. They had a favorite in George Christopher, who was a former mayor of a Republican mayor of San Francisco. You heard that correctly, folks. Republican mayor of San Francisco. We were talking a long time ago. But Reagan just rolled his way through the primary, won it by a 2-1 margin, and then rolled over Pat Brown. It was the right moment because Reagan was talking about society kind of coming apart at the seams, be it campus unrest, be it Vietnam, and so forth. And this ties into the recall with Arnold. It was the right moment for Arnold in terms of where California was, but also for Arnold, he only had to run in a 60-day campaign. And I think if you wanted to run Tom Hanks for governor, if you wanted to run some other A-lister for governor, you would want to do it in a 60-day campaign. Why? Because the fact is they don't know that much about public policy. The less time they would have to be stretched on the rack and have to explain their positions on things, the worse off for their candidacy. So you just want a 2-month sprint. So again, but it gets back to this idea, you're going to be the governor of California. Maybe some of these people think they want to be the president or something like that. It's just not a fun job to have right now.
No, and Bill, it's interesting. You saw that lack of knowledge with Steve Garvey when he was running for senator. He was well spoken, but it just was so obvious that he did not have a deep understanding of the policy issues. I think he had pretty good instincts for what was wrong, but he couldn't explain anything at a deep level. And Bill, when I look at those candidates and you think about Reagan and you think about how charming he could be, and you think about him, how engaging he could be, he had that quality, just like, in my opinion, Bill Clinton has that quality. It's a wonderful quality to have if you're a politician. You can meet somebody and 15 seconds later, the person thinks, this is my new best friend. It's hard to see that type of charm among those 6 out there. Katie Porter, far from it. Steve Hilton, I think, has that. He's a radio personality, so he has that within his skill set. But he's a Republican, and he's another guy that I think has pretty good economic instincts. But Bill, what do you think the chances are of either Hilton or Bianco appearing on a November ballot after a primary?
It depends. I think, first of all, if Kamala is going to run. I talked to smart friends in Sacramento who are convinced she's going to run because why? Because she wants to get the L off her forehead. She is right now a political loser, having lost her last campaign. They think she wants to get a W to erase that, but I don't know. Just you talk about a Pyrrhic victory, though, because you're gonna win that campaign, but then probably walk away as a poor governor. I mentioned her though because the easiest strategy for her would be to jump in the race, essentially Bigfoot the other Democrats, but then also spend a bunch of money and time really talking up the Republican opponent, which is what Newsom did when he ran for governor in 2008. Is classic campaign tactics in California. So I would argue that with only 2 Republicans running against a larger field of Democrats, you could get a Republican running for in the November as well. Now, Steve Hilton will tell you that now is the time, it's the right moment for Republican in California. He has a point in terms of some policy issues, but just the math is just crushing. Our colleague Lanhee Chen ran for controller in 2022, and he pulled off what I call the Chen curve. Or the Chen line. It's like the Mendoza line in baseball, hitting 200. Lanhee ran pretty much a flawless campaign. He got endorsed by the Los Angeles Times, and he got 44.9% of the vote. He still needed another 500,000 votes to win. There are just not enough votes out there for Republicans. By the way, one California note I want to add in here before we segue to our next topic. When I was in South Carolina, my last night there, I took my sister and brother-in-law out to dinner, and I decided it was time to use my California debit card. I got this from the state, I think a year or 2 ago. This is part of the very bad idea, I think, in retrospect, Lee just handing out money to people. And so this bad boy is supposedly worth $200. So we went out to a nice restaurant, pulled out and said, we're going to eat on the state of California tonight. And guess what? It got rejected.
Why am I not surprised?
I don't know if it's a function of using it outside the state, but boy, if you want to sum up California's problems in a nutshell, here's $200. Oh, by the way, it's not going to work.
Lee, you recently took part in Santa Barbara's 2025 South County Economic Summit, in which you focused on homelessness and housing in California. You proposed three ideas for affordable housing. Number one, reducing building costs. Two, facilitating building where land is more affordable. And three, leveraging efficiencies of modern technologies in building. Lee, are you hopeful that there can be some traction on these and other similar proposals made by others?
Jonathan, not particularly, because we know what the issues are. It's there to fix. It could be fixed in a nanosecond with a supermajority in both the Senate and the Legislative Assembly, and a governor who could sign off on that immediately. What really has happened in California is we've really focused our building efforts on what just people don't want and what's expensive. So, for example, Scott Wiener, state legislator, he's perhaps I think by far the most devoted to trying to get housing bills passed. And his emphasis, and I think the party's emphasis, he's a Democrat, is to build where land is very, very expensive, and to build high density housing that ends up being very, very expensive in terms of construction costs. You take expensive land and expensive building with various types of prevailing wage rules and an awful lot of overhead costs, and pretty soon you've made housing that's supposed to be affordable anything but that. Senator Wiener, I think, his efforts are really just the opposite of what my views are. I know developers who tell me that California costs twice or even more than twice as much as other states just for the construction costs. And so when you take that into account, areas such as, we're going to build, affordable housing in Santa Monica or Beverly Hills or San Francisco or in Silicon Valley, it's just simply not possible. It is simply not possible. You end up with housing that can be in excess of $1 million per apartment unit. So that's anything but affordable. So the simple idea is that you simply can never create affordable housing unless you reduce costs, which means you go to where land is not so nearly as expensive as it is, say, in Palo Alto or Santa Monica or San Francisco or Beverly Hills. And you reduce regulations so the building costs aren't so high. You try to use modern efficiencies of manufacturing. We can now build quality housing that's built from start to finish in a factory for about $100 or less a square foot, which is probably a fifth or a sixth of the costs as we're seeing in some affordable housing developments. And if you look at the state, if you look where cities are growing, the fastest growing community in California is a little place called Shafter. And it's not so little, it's growing very, very quickly. It's about, I think, 15 miles outside of Bakersfield. The median home price there is somewhere in the threes. So why is that growing? Because it's less expensive. There's no complicated or fancy economics associated with that. But the governor's now in his 7th year. He's got one more year to go. He ran in 2018 on tremendously expanding housing and making housing affordable. Well, the median single family home today in California, according to the California Association of Realtors, somewhere around $880,000. Anywhere near the coast. So, near Stanford, San Francisco, coastal area of Southern California, is well above $1 million per unit. So, so what we've done is we've just really made California unaffordable for most people. We could build homes, I think, for well below $250,000, perhaps close to $200,000, and that would make purchasing a home a lot more realistic for an enormous number of families, but I just don't see that happening, at least under the current political leadership.
So Lee, there's a study put out recently by a Long Island-based group called Leave the Key, and they looked at census data, they looked at Bureau of Economic Analysis data, and here's the conclusion, Lee. This is just going to blow you guys away. They came to the conclusion that it takes the average Californian over 2,639 workdays to save for a home deposit. And here's the numbers they're using, Lee. This, by the way, is the second worst number. Hawaii is worse, apparently. So there you go. Trouble in paradise. They figured it this way. Residents need 10 years and 6 months to afford a median home value of $725,000, Lee, so we're not even at the $880,000 market bet. Golden State average after-tax income is $69,140. With monthly expenses, this gets cost of living California, Lee, it leaves with you with about $1,150 for a home buyer to put down. So
Yeah, exactly.
let me ask you this question though, Lee. After World War II, there very famously was Levittown, speaking of Long Island.
Yeah.
What would happen if Mr. Levitt, God rest his soul, came to California in 2026 and wanted to build Levittown in California?
He would probably turn around and go back to Pennsylvania. He would say, hey, let me build where land is not so expensive, and I'll put up these cookie cutter beauties and we can save an awful lot of money. And he might stick around for a few months, and when he finds out that it'll be perhaps a decade or two for building permits, he will hightail it. He will hightail it away. You know, Bill, we had an attempt at building a Levittown just outside of Valencia in Southern California. Tejon Ranch, which is several 100,000 acres. I think it goes back to the time of when Mexico owned that area and sold it at some point. Tejon Ranch was going to be home to a 60,000 person community. So small city, bigger than a town, you know, not gargantuan, but 60,000 people, 20,000 homes. Plans were submitted in 1994. The first homes went on sale in 2021. What is that? 27 years after the plans were first submitted. And because time is money, those homes now cost as much as, I believe, $2.8 million. So, you know, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot here. This could be stopped by the governor and the state legislators immediately. There was just one environmental lawsuit after another. The governor has railed about CEQA. He talks glowingly about changes they made to CEQA. These are all changes that nibble around the edges. CEQA still is weaponized to block and delay development, and it is Californians who lose on that. And I wish reporters like Ashley Zavala, who I think is absolutely wonderful. She's up in Sacramento. She's not necessarily the friend of the governor. I hope she gets interested in housing, and I hope she asks him, well, why haven't you done more to change CEQA? Builders say that's what's needed to reduce building costs. So, you know, you're in your 7th year. Why hasn't it happened yet? I'd love for another reporter to ask him that question.
Well, Ronald Reagan, speaking of Reagan, he brought CEQA into the world. Not one of the better Reagan legacy items. And CEQA is that rock on which every governor tends to land his ship. But CEQA has to do with construction. The issue here to me is also affordability. And I think the state needs to take a very large look at a lot of sort of competing factors here. Where in California can you build a house that people can afford to buy? And let's say $800,000, but just a random number. And if you're going to buy a home for $800,000, where will it be? What kind of job are you going to be able to get? And where are you going to do your job? Can you work at home maybe at that $800,000 job? Can you be close to a large city and a business center at $800,000, which gets into infrastructure issues, which takes us back to the price of gasoline and so forth. So it's a Gordian knot.
It is a Gordian knot. And, you know, it's unfortunate that California, you know, so many years ago when we talked about a high-speed rail, and, you know, that's another conversation for maybe we'll have in July, given what's just happened with the DOT telling California they're planning on rescinding federal funding for California high-speed rail. That really should have been prioritized to bring people from the Central Valley, places like Stockton, for example, to Silicon Valley or the Bay Area, or from the Inland Empire to areas with high-paying jobs such as Los Angeles. that would have just made so much more sense than to say, well, we've got to connect Los Angeles and San Francisco. No, we didn't need to. There's very affordable flights. No one really wants to. No, we don't see people really wanting to take a train from there to Los Angeles. And who's not to say that the state wouldn't have messed that up as much as they messed up the existing plans. But you're absolutely right. The high-paying jobs are in areas where housing is extremely expensive, and it made an awful lot of sense to be able to bring people from more affordable areas to locations that have the jobs they want. But that's not what happened.
I wrote not too long ago about high-speed rail, and I always feel guilty when I do, Lee, because I feel like I could just write about it 6 months later and just change a few things around and finish that column in about 2 minutes because it's the same old story. But it's interesting. So you mentioned, the Trump administration wants to pull away, I think, $4 billion in funding for high-speed rail. The High-Speed Rail Authority quickly said, well, we're in a good place, actually, and if we keep going forward, we're going to reach our goal of $20 billion to keep this going. But what they don't mention is, Lee, there is a $100 billion gap, and the number keeps growing. So there's just no, and if you go and look at the website for high-speed rail in California, there is no promise date for when the thing ever reaches Los Angeles and San Francisco. So it's a folly, plain and simple.
No, yeah, it's absolutely a folly. And, Bill, it's interesting. I don't know how it ever received the latest funding, which was done from the Biden administration, because to be competitive and to qualify for that type of federal funding, you need to demonstrate an established source of remaining funds to cover the costs. And California simply doesn't have that. We now are in the process of building 170 mile system from Bakersfield to Merced that looks like it's going to cost, years ago it was going to cost, I think, 25 or 28 billion. Then it went up to 33 billion. Now it looks like it could be as much as 38 billion. It was supposed to be ready in 2030. Now it's looking more like 2035. I mean, again, when you talk about kicking the can down the road, this is a great example of that. And Bill, we were living in California when that vote came up for the ballot initiative that was going to in which California voters approved nearly $10 billion as seed money. I'd love to go back in time with Michael J. Fox and his DeLorean and tell people, hey, guess what? You're going to have maybe by 2035, maybe high-speed rail. We don't know how fast it's going to be, but it'll operate between Bakersfield and Merced, and it'll cost about $38 billion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it was a down payment of about $10 billion, $38 to $40. $40 billion is a price tag, and it was going to be done by 2020.
Moving on, gentlemen, on the homelessness issue, Governor Newsom's new mantra is, quote, no more excuses. In May, he announced a new ordinance calling for cities to ban encampments without delay. Newsom says in part that local authorities should not be duly unlimited from clearing encampments, and such policies should prioritize shelter and services. Bill, what do you make of the governor's tough stance, and will the mayors listen?
I think it's something that plays very well outside of California, but does not play very well inside California, at least with those handful of mayors who really hate this kind of messaging. The governor seems to have an Iditarod approach to this, that essentially I will whip the sled dogs ahead of me, tell them mush, and they'll move forward. Mayors don't operate that way. Mayors have sensitive operations in their cities. It's just Newsom's just not really approaching this the right way. He needs to be more collaborative with them rather than showing them up. But look, he's simply playing for the cameras, and this gets into a lot of 2028 speculation, I suppose, too. Sometimes Gavin sounds very progressive. Sometimes he sounds not progressive and tough. And Lee and Jonathan, this gives him a great example to sound tough. I'm fed up. I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. No more excuses. Do something. It also is a good way to deflect. It's a theory that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. So go on the offensive and tell the mayors to get their act together. And oh, by the way, cover up that your own record as governor on homelessness is pretty awful. And oh, by the way, as mayor of San Francisco, you promised to end it by 2010.
The governor's been taking a lot of heat for the homeless problem, and it's well deserved. Back, I don't know, what was it, Bill, 20 years ago when he was mayor of San Francisco, he promised to end homelessness in San Francisco by, what was it, 2010?
By the end of the decade, yeah.
Yeah. And then I believe his State of the Union in 2020 was
Devoted entirely to the topic. Yep.
yeah, the headline of that was homelessness, and homelessness has increased
And he
by
periodically goes out and he puts on a t-shirt, a ball cap, and jeans, and he helps clear out an encampment under the freeway. So he shows he cares, but the problem doesn't change. It gets back to what I mentioned earlier. This is the ugly California meme that's going to follow him wherever he runs for president. This is what
and so he's so I think he's trying to offload it onto others, but at the end of the day, there's homelessness is up 60% since 2015. The LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, has looked at hospital admissions of those who are homeless and counts somewhere between 300 to 400,000 unique homeless people over the course of the year. So the 187,000 count we currently have, that comes from just a single night count. So it may be twice as high as that. There was the $24 billion in state funding that the state auditor was very critical about. They said there's a number of programs we can't evaluate because the state lacks information on costs and outcomes. It hasn't tracked, gathered information, or evaluated the efforts to prevent or end homelessness. It hasn't aligned its action plan with its goal to collect information, ensure accountability. It was just an overwhelmingly critical report. And when that happened last year, when that report was issued last year, the governor immediately blamed local government. He just said, "Look, it's not our fault. It's the fault of counties and cities." But at the end of the day, the buck has got to stop with, as Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. But Gavin doesn't want the buck to stop there, and it's obvious why because it's an awful failure, and he's the governor. And it really goes to, I think, just a failed vision of what it takes to deal with homelessness. For a long time, the state was implicitly okay with drug abuse and drug use on the streets. So we know that certain blocks of San Francisco were taken over. And now the governor's saying, "Oh, well, clear all those out. We're going to, turn the ship around." And the governor was kind of all about housing first, which said, "Hey, build a $1 million apartment unit and put this person who has horrible substance abuse issues or terrible mental health issues, put him into that apartment, and then everything will be okay." Well, it didn't work out that way. The state was very slow to recognize just the very significant numbers of homeless, particularly homeless men. And the modal homeless person in California is a single male, over 45, over 50, and they have severe mental health issues or on average severe mental health issues and or substance abuse issues. So that's really what we need to be dealing with. And it's it's difficult for a local politician to be told by the governor, "Hey, there are these people that are homeless in your city. We're going to write you a check. It's not going to be enough to cover everything you need to do, but take care of it." And it's like, well, I don't know, why do you call these people ours? Just because they're sitting here in Long Beach or Santa Ana or Orange? Why is this our problem? Why can't you come here and we'll figure out how to deal with it? So, Bill, as you mentioned, there's not a sense of a collaboration here. And I kind of have the feeling that the governor several years ago, figured this, we're not going to win on this. So I think I'll try to do some other things that maybe will make me politically popular, and I'll try to deflect off to others.
Yeah, I'm starting to think that the easiest job in California in 2026 will be debate moderator when the gubernatorial candidates get together, because every question, Lee, will be simply, "What are you going to do about?" So on this podcast, what are you going to do about homelessness? What are you going to do about the budget? What are you going to do about the ZEV mandate?
There's a never-ending laundry list there. They'll have to have a lot of debates because they'll only be able to do a small fraction of them on any one debate. And it'll be like, debate 18. Well, here's the issues we're talking about today here on debate 18.
But it will be interesting, Lee, to see if Kamala does not run, if they go after Newsom at all, if they try to throw him under the bus on a particular topic.
Yeah, I wonder, Bill, how much that will do for her I mean, it's obvious. I mean, to me, I think it's obvious she would win the race. But is that really a win for her in California? I mean, she would be overwhelmed by the policy issues. I can't imagine her being a successful governor in terms of dealing with the problems we're talking about now, because they're going to be that much worse when she would take office. So, do you really think it's about getting a W?
I think so. It's, I mean, look, if Nixon had not run for president in 1968, his political career would have been largely defined by that last gubernatorial race in California. We'll have Nixon to kick around, and right now her political career is defined by what? Not being the historic vice president she was, by running a terrible campaign and losing to Donald J. Trump. So I imagine that maybe, I don't know about her worldview, but I imagine the people around her thinking, she really needs to rehabilitate her image by showing that she can win a race. But again, it's classic Pyrrhic victory. You win the battle, but you're going to lose the war, I think, in terms of having to run California.
Gentlemen, moving back to our A-list conversation, in particular, Clint Eastwood, who I said I'd conclude the show with. His birthday just passed last Saturday, on May 31st. He is 95 years old, so happy birthday, Clint Eastwood. We also have another birthday coming up. Thomas Sowell will also be 95 years old on June 30th. Gentlemen, would you care to reflect on the impact of both of these California giants on America and the Golden State over the past century or nearly a century?
Lee, why don't you take Tom Sowell, because fellow economist, and I believe he also has UCLA DNA, does he not?
Yeah, Tom was on the UCLA economics faculty. I mean, long before I was there. But he's a great pure economist. The person who was department chair at the time that Tom left for Hoover, his name was Harold Demsetz, and he passed away. But when I first went to UCLA a number of years ago, he was still quite active in the department. We would talk a lot, and he told me, one day Hoover was looking for somebody, and they called me up, and I told Tom, you'd be perfect for this. You'd be a great fit for them. You don't like teaching these undergraduates that aren't really into economics. You hate faculty meetings, so this would be a great job for you. And then Tom went up to Hoover. Bill, if I can add, I do have one Clint Eastwood story. Back in the day, between college years during the summer, I worked in Carmel, just a few doors down from the restaurant he owned, which was the Hog's Breath Inn. And so I would sometimes go there for a drink at the late at night. And Carmel is a little town that pretty much rolls up the sidewalks around 8:30 or 9. So it would be around 9:30 or 10, and we'd be having a drink outside at the Hog's Breath, and it had this huge fireplace. Everyone would gather around because even in the summertime, a Carmel night is going to be under 60 degrees. And he would come and join us for a drink every once in a while. And people often talk about Nicholson. No matter what role Jack Nicholson is in, he's still Jack Nicholson. And it's not that I got to know Clint Eastwood particularly well, but he was a man of few words. And what I came to know is whatever role Clint Eastwood played, he was still being Clint Eastwood.
When I worked in the governor's office in the 1990s, a Republican governor, we had two people who were sort of dedicated lines to celebrities, and one was an assistant to the chief of staff who was Arnold's go-to person. If Arnold Schwarzenegger had a question, had a need, a concern, he would call this guy, and the guy would pick up. It's like being a 10 million mile member of an airline, and so Mr. Ohanian, thanks for calling. So that was Arnold, but the other one was Clint Eastwood, because he was the mayor of Carmel at the time, and he had all kinds of environmental concerns. And usually Clint was not in a good mood when he called about something. And so it was very funny for this fellow. He was a deputy cabinet secretary. It began as the most wonderful thing. Oh boy, I get to talk to Clint Eastwood. And then, he's in a bad mood. But so Clint gets back to the theory of, or Mr. Eastwood, I should say, gets back to our theory about kind of peak in politics, because his peak would have been in the 1990s when he ran for mayor of Carmel by the Sea, and the right fit for him would have been 1998 in that governor's race, but we will never know. But interesting guy, and the world is politics always gifted by his line in Dirty Harry, which Ronald Reagan stole, which is, of course, go ahead, make my day.
He was very popular as Carmel mayor because I remember this may have only happened once, but there was a big dispute about a piece of land. On the one hand, many wanted to preserve it as green space, and Carmel is just it's a jewel. And there were developers who wanted to create some stuff on there. And so Clint just stepped in and wrote a check and purchased it from the developers and kept his green belt. And everybody was happy. The developers were happy. The townspeople were happy. He was in a financial position to be able to do that. But yeah, it would have been interesting to see if Clint as governor, particularly compared to some of those in the race today.
Well, he could have run if he'd won in 1988. Then maybe there's no recall with Arnold. Who knows?
As always, gentlemen, this has been an hour of interesting and timely analysis. Thank you for your time.
Thanks,
fellas. Happy summer.
You've been listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, the Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the free world. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you might hear it. If you don't mind, please spread the word. Get your friends to have a listen. The Hoover Institution has Facebook, Instagram, and X feeds. Our X handle is @HooverInst. That's @HooverInst. Bill Whalen is on X. His handle is @BillWhalenCA. And Lee Ohanian is also on X. His handle is @Lee_Ohanian. Please visit the Hoover website at hoover.org and sign up for the Hoover Daily Report, where you can access the latest scholarship and analysis from our fellows. And also check out California on Your Mind, where Bill Whalen and Lee Ohanian write every week. Again, this is Jonathan Mavroidis sitting in Bill Whalen's chair this week. He'll be back for another episode of Matters of Policy and Politics. Thank you for listening.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.